Hearty shalom to you. Jeffrey Seif here. Glad you are there. I keep saying that and I keep meaning it. And I'm glad you're interested in taking a dive into biblical literature. Pleased as well that you want to go with me. I'm just glad you want to do it because I think that Bible study is a good thing. And I'm honored that it's a thing you would consider with a virtual stranger like me. Well, Rabbi Paul is on his way to Jerusalem, last stop, and now we get there. We're told in chapter 21 of Acts that when he arrived in verse 17, he was received gladly. There was controversy associated with him. They're glad to see him. They extend fellowship. We're told in verse 18 that Paul went into Jacob, Yaakov, James. This is Jesus Christ's half-brother, who would in effect become the leader of this expanding ministry in Jerusalem. So Paul checks in. It's protocol. He meets with the elders, and James is foremost. We're told after greeting them, Paul reported to them in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his service. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. I mean, it was something different at the end of the day. What Paul was doing was different than what they were doing because it's different context, different circumstances. In Jerusalem, they lived and functioned as Jews, the more so, and we'll see that in a second. You get away from Jerusalem out there, the more so into the Greco-Roman world, and there's less of that Jewish element, and because you're dealing with a population that's more and more constituted by women and men of non-Jewish extract. You're away from Jewish culture. From Jerusalem is the centerpiece of Israelite religion. Well, Paul's out there hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from it, dealing with different people in different contexts. And of course, they're doing different things. I mention that because, people today say, oh, why can't Christians be united today like they were yesterday? I mean, that's delusional. I mean, that's fantasy. The truth of the matter is there was no one way to do church yesterday that they all subscribed to. There were various ways, and it was predicated upon who the people were and where they were. But here, Paul, who is doing things a little differently, goes to Jerusalem, and people rejoice that he's got a different crew, and it's a different context, and they're glad to see the gospel penetrating into that world. But there is an issue. We're told in the next verse, in verse 20b, they look at Paul and say, you see, brother, how many myriads there are among the Jewish people who have believed. And they are all zealous for the Torah. Now, myriads are thousands. And when you look at how many myriads, that's thousands upon thousands. I mention this because the image is, Jesus came and all the Jews rejected Jesus, so Jesus rejected all the Jews. Well, whoever wrote this didn't get that memo because they're reporting another kind of narrative, that Paul is going to Jerusalem. He's well received by the leaders of the group, and we note the group itself is thousands and thousands and thousands strong. But we don't just note that, we note as well that, to move on, they are zealous for the Torah. People today think, well, a Jewish person accepts Jesus, you jettison all that Jewish stuff, and then go Baptist, Lutheran, Methodist, Pentecostal, Bible church, whatever the case may be. Whatever it is, whatever the case may be, Judaism is yesterday's suitcase. You leave it you leave it, and you move on and walk in different kinds of dress, different kinds of clothes you put on. You become a Baptist, a Lutheran, a Methodist, whatever. But you're a converted Jew. You're out of that. You're into this. Well, apparently these people didn't see it like that. Well, they were ill-informed. Excuse me. This is the headquarters of what it means to be Christian. It's led by Jesus Christ's half-brother, as well as others that were party to the things that Jesus said and did. Peter is foremost in this mix as well, as very influential amongst the Jews in Jerusalem. There are thousands, and we're told they lived and functioned as Jews. That's why I say people come up to me, they go, Seif, how long have you been a converted Jew? And I like to say, I'm not a converted Jew, I'm a converted sinner, and it's not a sin to be a Jew. That riles some, but what of it? Here, I think it's insightful that Paul makes his way to Jerusalem. He's greeted by the brethren who then express a concern. They go, look, Paul, glad you're here, glad to hear what you're doing out there. Now look, Paul, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish believers here. They're really into Torah observance. In verse 21, they have been told about you that you teach all the Jewish people among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to the customs. Now this is exactly what the message has been to Jews for 2,000 years. Well, after this, I should say. You want to accept Jesus Christ, do not walk according to the customs. Don't. It's a new thing, it's not a Jew thing. That's an old way, this is a new day. I mean, that's the way it's articulated. I mean, that's the story, that's the narrative. But what's interesting is that's not what's at play here. Paul comes back to Jerusalem. They're living and functioning as Jews. And James, Jesus Christ's half-brother, representing all of them, says, hey, listen, Paul, glad to see you. Now listen, a lot of Jewish people here that believe in Jesus, you know, and they've heard a mistake that you're telling people to forsake Moses and the customs. That's what you're telling Jews to do out there. In verse 23, so do what we tell you, etc. And he says, go into the temple and make these sacrifices, etc. If you look in verse 24, in order that all will realize that there is nothing to the things that they have been told about you. It's a big misunderstanding, Paul. These people think you're telling Jewish people to jettison Moses. Now listen, in order that you can clarify that's one big misunderstanding, you go to that temple and you show yourself Torah observant. That way they'll realize that it's a disconnect. They're mistaken. That James says, go and help them to realize there is nothing to the things that have been told about you, but that you yourself walk in an orderly manner, keeping the Torah. It's very interesting. Paul here, now this is Luke's biographer. This is written by Luke, Paul's biographer. And the story here is a misconstrual of Paul that he's jettisoned things Jewish now that he's become Christian. And he's telling Jews to do that. That, according to biblical literature, is a false narrative. Now, that is the narrative that's been put forth for 1900 years, but it's an incorrect narrative. To me, I find it fascinating that the founder of Christianity, the religion, the one that left his imprint, the more so on New Testament literature describing what it means to be Christian, he himself was a religious Jew, not an ex-Jew, didn't convert out. He still lived and functioned as a Jew. Here's the point. Or here's a point, and I don't have time to develop it ad nausea. But principle here is if you look at Paul, Paul wasn't out there in the Greco-Roman world telling Jews they needed to cease being Jewish in order to believe in Jesus. Paul's message to non-Jews was that you don't need to become Jews in order to follow Jesus. You're not circumcised, leave it alone. Ain't no big deal at the end of the day because we got something new happening here. This what it means to be a believer is all about Jews and Gentiles together. It's a new thing. It's a we thing. It's a collective of different types. And you be you. Paul wasn't telling Jews, he wasn't disrespecting what it meant to be Jewish. Paul was just telling Gentiles that you don't need to jump in there and abide it. Now, there is some today that argue, oh, individuals of non-Jewish extract need to do just that, but I think that ignores the principle here in the literature. In any case, it's a great story. Paul living and functioning as a Jew, you know, it's just, I love it. And part of the discovery of Messianic Jewish experience is to recover that walking with Jesus as a Jew story. What does that mean? What does that look like? What are the implications and applications? And a reason for a Tree of Life Bible, a translation that's Jewish sensitive, is to that and all else contributes to us wanting to bring forth a testimony that comports with Jewish sensibilities. And we're so very thankful for friends like you. Hey, let's do this again in a week. God bless. Jeffrey Seif, signing out.